Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this morning with Jaxon Liebeck from Firefly Aerospace. My name's Holly. I'm from AROSE, Australian Remote Operations for Space and Earth, and I'm super excited to be hosting this session with Jaxon today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands from which we join this session today and pay respect to the people's ongoing culture, beliefs, and relationships with the land and their rich contributions to life in the many regions that we live in. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A button. This is where you can ask questions and we will select some from Jaxon to answer. Please include your first name and where you're from, including the school if you're a student or teacher. We love student questions. We also love teacher questions. So please don't hesitate to jot your questions in the Q&A. We've got participants today from all across Australia, so we may not get through all your questions, but we will do our best. So in 2025, Firefly Aerospace were the first commercial organisation in history to successfully land on the moon. And the flight direction of this mission was the person you're about to meet, our young Australian Jaxon Liebeck. Jaxon grew up in Pemberton in southwest Western Australia, and after attending the FISE United Space School at NASA's Johnson Space Center, moved to the United States to earn a Bachelor of Aerospace Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, ultimately becoming the flight director for Firefly Aerospace's Blue Ghost mission, the first successful commercial uncrewed lunar lander. So it's time to give a massive welcome to Jaxon.
Holly, thanks for having me. Okay, as Holly said, hi, my name is Jaxon Liebeck. I grew up in Western Australia and I now work in the United States in the aerospace domain. So a little bit about me. I come from a small town in Pemberton, in Western Australia called Pemberton. It's about 4 hours south of Perth, and you may know Pemberton for having the third tallest trees in the world. I also have three siblings. One is a mining engineer, my older brother. My older sister is a flight attendant, and my younger sister is a vet. I attended Pemberton District High School until year seven. I then graduated primary school and went to Manjimup Senior High School, which was about a 45-minute bus ride away. And so my class changed from 8 kids to about 60 kids, which was quite a large jump, but still a relatively small school. My favorite classes were math, physics, and history. And if anyone's interested, the ATAR classes that I took were math methods, math specialist, ATAR physics, ATAR chemistry, and ATAR English. My math specialist was actually online through SIDE because my school was too small to afford a math specialist teacher. I enjoy all types of sports, especially Aussie rules. I'm a Freo supporter, so hopefully going to the game this week if the weather permits. As Holly said, I attended the United Space School in the States. So that's a program where they take 40 to 50 students worldwide to NASA Johnson Space Center, which is where they do all of the human space flight. They have mission control there and they train the astronauts. I applied for a spot that was what was called open enrollment. So one of 8 kids to just apply and go. So anyone listening today, if you're in the age range of year 10 to year 12, you can also apply. Australia takes 2 kids every year, one from Trinity here in Perth and one from Broken Hill. But like I said, anyone can apply. And so that was in July 2016. I was on what was called the Maroon team. As you can see, there are 5 teams there: yellow, red, maroon, green, and blue. The Maroon team was responsible for designing the landing and takeoff system from Mars, and we were designing a Mars mission together. While I was at the United Space School, I was able to meet astronauts, as you can see down there in the bottom right, Leroy. I was also able to meet aerospace engineers and scientists. That's what really kickstarted my interest in doing aerospace and made it a reality. So after I went to the United Space School, I'd set my eyes on going to the University of Texas in Austin because someone said that that was a good place to go. It was the only university I applied to in the States, which is pretty unheard of. Most kids apply to multiple universities. And so the University of Texas at Austin, like it says, it's in Austin, Texas. There are 55,000 students that attend. That's around about 40 to 45,000 undergrad, and then 10,000 more of graduate. And for context, they have a football stadium that can hold more than the MCG. So for their college football games, you can have over 100,000 people sitting in there watching students the age of 18 through 22 play. While at the University of Austin, I also joined the Texas Spacecraft Laboratory. So that is an organization where we would build CubeSats, and as you can see in the photo there, that's an example of a CubeSat that we made. That is 30 centimeters long, 10 centimeters width, and 10 centimeters in depth. And then my time there, I also joined the Longhorn Rocketry Association. So that is an organization where you get to learn and build your own rocket. And if you can launch to a specific altitude, a specific height, you get your certificate in rocketry for level one. And we would also do collaborative rockets for NASA competitions. And we would go out to West Texas, a couple hours west of Austin, and participate in competitions. Uh, Austin is where I met my now wife, so you can see us in the bottom right corner there with our golden retriever. After graduating, or actually before I graduated with an aerospace degree, I took a job part-time at a company called Lunar. They were a startup out of Tucson, Arizona. So that was about 13 hours drive west of Austin. And I joined them when I graduated as their first full-time engineer as well. So my role was mission manager and spacecraft engineer. So they had developed a new technology that harnessed low radio frequencies to map the subsurface of the Earth. And so I was responsible for designing the CubeSat that was supposed to house that technology, and then also responsible for finding a launch for us as mission manager. So I did that total for about a year, and then I decided to move to Washington, D.C. and work for NASA. So my time at NASA, I was the lead power and thermal operations engineer. So we worked on what's called the GOES-R spacecraft, geostationary orbital environmental satellites. As you can see in the bottom right photo, there's a picture of the spacecraft. The last couple ones that were built cost over $1 billion US, so it's even more in Aussie dollars. And so they were quite large. And so they were the main weather satellites in the States, and I was responsible for being on the launch team. So we would set up a spacecraft, we would take it from the company that built it, set it up, launch it, operate it, commission it, and then give it to the National Weather Service. So during my time at NASA, I was able to gain a lot of experience, as you can see here in the photos at the top right. That's Kennedy Space Center down in Florida. That's where they launch rockets. Bottom right was in the facility at Lockheed Martin in Denver, Colorado, where they build the spacecraft. And then on the next slide, you can see here, top left is in Fairmont, West Virginia, where we have our ground stations. So you can see those very large antennas. Those are the antennas that we use to communicate with the spacecraft. These spacecraft were at what's called a geostationary orbit. So that is about 50,000 kilometers from Earth, and it orbits the Earth at the same rate that the Earth spins. So the spacecraft is looking at the same spot on the ground all the time. So that means our antennas can just be fixed in that position, looking at the spacecraft, and they don't have to track it whizzing by. Down on the bottom left is a thermal vacuum chamber. It's quite large. It kind of looks like a Star Wars spaceship, but when we test our spacecraft, we need to put them in thermal vacuum chambers so that we can test the environments that they would go through in space, which can be very hot and cold, positive of 200 degrees Celsius sometimes and negative 200 degrees Celsius sometimes. So it can get very hot and cold, and that means we have to design our components and spacecraft to survive that. We also have to design it to survive zero atmosphere, so no air. So that's the vacuum part of the chamber. It sucks all of the air out. This middle photo, where I look like a overdressed lunch lady, that is in a clean room. So the spacecraft is so sensitive that the dead skin or the hair falling off your head can actually be detrimental to the spacecraft. So you have to wrap yourself up and ground yourself so you don't have any static electricity when you're touching the spacecraft. So that was in the payload processing facility. That was before we integrated it to the rocket to go into space. And so if you ever needed to go pee or you were thirsty, you would have to leave that room, get undressed, and then come back, and it takes about another 15 minutes. So there are some people that do that as their daily job, and I don't envy that. During my time at NASA as well, I was able to go, like I said, to Kennedy, and down here you can see one of an example rocket launch. And if you ever get to go to Florida or New Zealand, where they do launch rockets, I highly recommend it. It's like an earthquake and nothing you've ever seen before. Also, at my time in DC, you can see up the top here is where mission control was. Even though we were doing weather satellites, I had to turn the big projector screen off when I took this photo. And then also down the bottom here, you can see in Washington, DC, they have one of the space shuttles. So the space shuttle behind me there is one that actually went to space. And then on the right, you can see my wife and my dog again. In the States, you can take your dogs to baseball games. So we used to do that fairly regularly. After working at NASA for 2 years, I decided to join Firefly Aerospace. So I joined them in 2024. Firefly Aerospace were originally a rocket company and still are today. And then they decided that they wanted to bid for a contract to be the first commercial company to land on the moon. So as you can see in the top right photo, there is our moon lander in the clean room. It's about 2.2 meters wide and 2 meters tall. And so my role for Blue Ghost Mission 1 was to be one of the three flight directors. So what a flight director does is they control the mission operations control room. As you can see down the bottom right, that is us all taking a photo after we did a propulsive burn on our way to the moon. So the team, you would have about 30 people in there during these critical operations. And then in quiescent operations, we call it, when the spacecraft is just cruising in space, we would have 2 to 3. So sometimes, as you can see in this top left photo, it was just my flight controller and I. That's actually us on Australia Day in 2025. It was about 2 a.m. for us. So everyone in Australia was having a much more relaxing time, but we had to work. And so a flight director, like I said, has to control the room. We also have to make the final decision. So a lot of the times it's me discussing with the chief engineer what we exactly want to do. And sometimes we disagreed and sometimes we agreed. So now we can go into the actual Blue Ghost mission. So like I said, we were trying to be the first commercial lunar landing. So NASA can get to the moon if they would like to, and it just costs a little bit more money. So instead, they adopted a process where they had smaller contracts. So our contract was $95 million and it was upgraded to $102 million later. And so for context, the cost of launch is over half of that. So with less than 100 full-time employees working on our spacecraft, we were able to build and launch our moon lander for less than $102 million. Most people try to get to the moon very quickly. And so you can see the number 8 here. A lot of lunar landers will do that very quickly, which is the trans-lunar injection. So that's what we call a propulsive burn to get us out of Earth's gravitational pull. And so what we did instead was we orbited the Earth for 4 weeks. We wanted to make sure that we knew what we were doing. We also had some payloads, we call them, which are scientific instruments, taking some measurements in what we call cislunar space. So while we orbited the Earth, we got about 2/3 of the way to the moon, and then we would come back around and get really close to Earth. When we orbited 3 times, that's when we did our trans-lunar injection, which puts us on a 4-day journey to meet the moon. Once we get to the moon, you can see spot number 10 here is where we had to do our lunar orbit insertion burn. So that means we're getting to the moon, we're going very, very quickly, and the moon's gravity is 1/6 that of Earth. So while we had to spend a lot of propellant getting out of Earth's gravity, we had to spend more propellant getting into the moon's gravitational influence to start orbiting the moon. This is a really risky burn, and we only had about 30 to 40 minutes to perform this. If we braked too hard, we would crash into the moon, and if we didn't brake enough, we would slingshot around the moon, and we would be lost in space. We'd essentially be a comet and come back years later. So once we did that burn, we orbited the moon for 2 weeks, getting closer and closer to it. During our time orbiting the moon, we would do checkouts, make sure that our cameras could identify spots on the moon that were similar lighting conditions to when we wanted to land. So our moon lander had a full autonomous landing. So you don't want an operator, we call it, calling decisions live. We designed it to land autonomously. So how do we land? We use something called the D'Souza sequence, and so there's a famous doctor out there that designed this landing sequence, and we used it. So we did what was called our DOI burn, our descent orbit insertion burn. That was actually on the far side of the moon, so we couldn't communicate with the moon lander because it was on the other side of the moon. When it came back around, we had to double check that it had correctly done the braking burn. What that burn did was put us in the exact right spot to coast for 50 minutes and then do another braking burn to actually try and land in the spot that we were supposed to land that NASA had chosen. So eventually we would pitch over and then we would get to about 500 meters above the ground. And so the pictures of the moon that we have now look great until you're about 500 meters above the surface. The resolution isn't enough, so the moon looks completely different. There are boulders and craters, and the picture we have here as a rendering is not very representative. I'll show a video of us landing, and you'll see how many more craters there are and how uneven the surface is. So we had to design a system that looked and found hazards and obstacles and actually chose a better spot to land. So we purposely made it do that twice. So next, I'm going to show you a video of us landing. If you go online, you can see the actual live stream of us trying to land on the moon. But because you're so far away from the moon, you can't live stream the landing. So we had to download the video later, and this is the video.
Khan, Chief Engineer on Ops. Y'all select the landing. We're on the moon.
So that was the first high definition footage of landing on, I believe, another body other than Earth. And so that was at around 2 a.m. on March 2nd. And so it was a beautiful time here in Australia, just in the afternoon for people to watch. We were up very late attempting to land on the moon. So the footage you just saw was real time and real footage. So it wasn't sped up or slowed down. And you can actually see here in this bottom photo here that it looks like the sun in the background. It's actually not. That's Earth, but because of the exposure of our cameras and how bright the sun's reflection off of Earth and the moon is, that's actually Earth. And so if anyone was in Australia on March 2nd, 2025, you're actually in this photo because we were using a ground station in Dongra, which is just 3 hours north of Perth here. So that was the ground station that we were using to land on the moon. So why did we go back to the moon? And so, like I said, NASA can do it, but it's very expensive, and they don't necessarily want to have to send astronauts back to the moon to collect data. So we were going to be the first company that operated for one full lunar day, which is 14.7 Earth days. And we had 10 scientific instruments on board doing, taking measurements and collecting data. We got over 100 gigabytes worth of data for NASA. And so some things that we did on the moon was we drilled into the surface nearly 2 meters. We also vacuumed up some lunar dust and we sifted it through different elements to see how it would react. And as you can see, that's down in the bottom right photo here. In space, we also received GNSS signals. There was an antenna that we had on board. We also repelled lunar dust electrically using an electrodynamic dust shield. And we did some other things as well. And like I said, the landing was fully automated. Once we'd landed, we would send all of the commands to all of the different scientific instruments. After Blue Ghost Mission 1, because we only lasted 14.7 Earth days, and then when you go into lunar night, it's just the same length, 14.7 Earth days, but it is in complete darkness. You have no solar electricity, and it gets very cold below negative 200 degrees Celsius. So we didn't design nor were we paid to try and last lunar night. So it was just a 14.7 Earth day mission, which is the longest that anyone has ever operated on the moon. So after Blue Ghost Mission 1, I was lucky enough to be offered a position to test rocket engines for 6 months. So that's really exciting until I realized I didn't know anything about rocket engines. I didn't specialize it in university, but I still decided to go over there and learn for 6 months, which was great. As you can see in the two photos on the left, we have some of the engines next to me. I was able to test our Breather and Lightning engines, which is for our Alpha rocket. So Alpha rocket is called a small launch vehicle. We could launch about 300 to 400 kilograms into low Earth orbit, so where most of the satellites are orbiting Earth today. We just successfully launched our 7th rocket. We've had some fail and some be successful. It's extremely hard to launch a rocket. And there's actually a company in Australia right now trying to do the same thing, Gilmore Space Technologies up in Queensland. Down the bottom right, you can see a hot fire. So that's what I worked on. So you would have to test every single engine, make sure that it is good enough to be used for the actual rocket. And as you can see, there's a little green spurt. That's sort of why Firefly has the color green. We use a catalyst that helps combust the liquid oxygen and the rocket propellant at the start. And when that burns, it burns a nice bright green color. So after testing rocket engines for 6 months, the company brought me back on the spacecraft team. And instead of being flight director, I moved to a position called spacecraft systems engineer. So I have a lot bigger of a take into the design of spacecraft. We have technology demonstrations in low Earth orbit. So I work as a systems engineer now, all the way from proposal till end of mission. And it's a lot more based on spacecraft design and making sure that we can do what we're trying to do. So the future of aerospace, in my opinion, we'll see if most of these come true. We are going back to the moon. NASA actually just released a report this morning of how they want to go back to the moon. They update it pretty regularly. So they want to have a moon base. Why should we go back to the moon? Well, the moon is a good starting point if we ever want to get to other planets. Rockets have two stages. One stage that you sometimes see the video of it falling off after you get to space. It's about 2/3 of the rocket. 2/3 of the rocket is just to get you out of Earth's atmosphere and into orbit. The second stage, which is usually less engines and smaller part of the rocket, gets you to the orbit you want. Because the moon has no atmosphere and it also the moon has no atmosphere, and then it also has 1/6 of Earth's gravity. It's much easier to launch from the moon. There are also precious resources on the moon, and we don't necessarily want to send them back down to Earth, but it's very expensive to send precious resources to the moon. So if we can mine them on the moon, then that's also a win. And then also the moon can see half of the Earth at any single point in time. So we have thousands of satellites now currently orbiting the Earth. And so if you can have those satellites on the moon instead, you can eliminate some of the satellites cluttering up space around the Earth. We still want to do interplanetary missions. NASA still wants to go to Mars after the moon. The moon is supposed to be a stepping stone on the way to Mars. There's an increasing need for security in space. Satellites are getting more and more intelligent, and so we're getting better at, being able to dock with other satellites and image other satellites. So most governments now are looking into how do we implement cybersecurity so that our assets in space are safe and can't be hacked. We want to clean up space. So there's a lot of what we call space junk or satellites that no longer operate in space. Satellites go around 10 kilometers a second. And so a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter piece of aluminium can actually destroy a satellite. So we want to make sure that two spacecraft don't collide and then cause thousands of those small pieces that are also going 10 kilometers a second all over space, and then hit other spacecraft. So we're looking to somehow clean up space safely, whether that's put spacecraft back into the atmosphere where they burn up, and then if there's anything left, they land in the ocean, or putting it at a Lagrange point, which is a point between two bodies like the moon and Earth where they can't get out of. It's like a graveyard in space. And then the last thing is data centers in space and AI in space. That's what a lot of companies are going for now. AI data centers take a lot of resources here on Earth. So if we're able to put them in space, we use a lot less resources and it's more economical for Earth. Importance industry skills. If you want to get into aerospace, or what I see in aerospace is programming and knowledge of computer hardware. So computer hardware is everything you use today, and getting knowledge of how we use that in space is really valuable. If we have batteries here on Earth and we have batteries in space, they're essentially the same thing. We just have to rate them for space. And so if you have an understanding of hardware down here, then you have an understanding of hardware in space. Hands-on experience. If you have the opportunity to do anything with your hands, that's the best way to learn. Self-driven learning ability. So YouTube, NASA documents, open source software. A lot of people don't realize all of the content that's out there for you to learn. A lot of people think that the Apollo moon landings were fake, but NASA pretty much shares everything that it does, and you can actually go onto their archives and watch 500 hours of footage of astronauts falling over. So I highly recommend, if any kid is interested or any teacher is interested, to go to NASA's websites, and there's a lot of resources out there that you can use to teach yourself about aerospace. And then the last one is communication skills. This is probably the most important thing. I would have not been a very good flight director if I was unable to communicate to the rest of the room or the experts for every subsystem. So if you're an engineer or a scientist or you're working in any field really, communication skills are really, really important. How to pursue a career in aerospace. You do not have to be an aerospace or aeronautical engineer. You do not have to have a degree in that. I work with a civil engineer. She wanted to work with, water tanks and things like that. She ended up getting a job at Firefly Aerospace. And most of her time is actually spent doing fashion design. She wanted to do civil engineering part-time. But then we discovered that we need to wrap our spacecraft with thermal blankets, so the spacecraft doesn't get too hot or too cold. And because she's a fashion designer, she is the best one to design those, cut them, and then also lay them on the spacecraft. The rest of us tried to do it, and we were pretty bad at it. So even, a fashion designer or a mechanic can get their ways into aerospace. Subscribe and keep up to date. So every morning I have a couple articles that I subscribe to for free that tells me what's going on in space. And over the last couple of years, there's been more and more articles about aerospace in Australia, which is nice to see. You can find a program or a project even online and participate. NASA does tons of competitions every year and they release what they do and the winners of those competitions. And I highly encourage schools or universities to look into those, play along, and act as if you're also participating. Or any student that wants to do that, you can do that as well. Use university or TAFE or other educational pathways to get involved. You're not just there to get good grades and get a certificate or a degree. You're there to learn. So if you're there just to get grades, you're not going to learn very well. And so that's not the purpose of why you're furthering your education. When I was in university, I tried to get too many A's, and then I realized that I was in the United States to do aerospace engineering. And when I started enjoying what I was doing, my grades actually got much better. And I was able to learn and take everything in much more effectively. And then be open to where opportunities take you. So when I wanted to do aerospace, there wasn't much here in Australia, let alone Western Australia. And so I moved to the United States. Nowadays, if you want to get into aerospace, there are opportunities here in Australia, more and more each year. And so, that may take you from Perth to Adelaide or Adelaide to Brisbane or Sydney to Melbourne. Be open to those opportunities. You can always come home eventually, but yeah, sometimes you may need to move away or do something that's a little bit outside of your comfort zone. And then I think we're going to share these links as well. We have plenty more videos that are just like the one that I showed you landing on the moon, but some cooler aerospace videos, I think. There's some of us flying around the moon or landing in 4 different views, or you can watch a rocket engine hot fire, which is pretty cool to watch. And then there's, launching a rocket in under 24 hours, or even how an engine test stand works. So you can see what I worked on for those 6 months. And then Holly, I think it's Q&A time.
Uh, yes, it is. That was really great, Jackson. Thank you for that. I've got some questions from some of the students that are sitting in here right now. Just a reminder to anyone else, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A, because if you don't ask them, then Jackson will not be able to answer them. So the first question we got is from April, who's one of our teachers on Ghanaland. She asked, what opportunities outside of school assisted you with your aerospace inspiration? So, like what kind of first started you down that path, essentially?
Yeah, for me it was visuals and books. The only way that I was able to learn about aerospace was to watch documentaries on YouTube, or read any textbooks or books that I could find online for free. So I was very interested in aerospace, but we didn't really offer much to learn about it at school. I wasn't even able to do computer programming or anything like that. So I had to find those resources myself. And so oftentimes there'd be a question on why haven't we found aliens or something like that. And if you just search up a video and then search the word NASA next to it, I knew that I was getting a good source, and I was able to watch and learn.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Xavier, who is one of the students with April, asked, you obviously have done a lot of self-driven learning, that's kind of put you on your aerospace trajectory. Do you think this is sort of a reasonable workload for an average student, or do you need to be like particularly driven or hardworking? Like, can anyone get to space? I guess is the question.
Yeah, I believe anyone can get to space. It's if you're determined enough. I don't think it's really a time question. If you enjoy what you're doing, then it doesn't feel like a burden on your time. But at the end of the day, there are going to be some sacrifices as well. You may want to study 6 hours a night for your ATAR classes, but maybe study 5 hours a night and do an extra hour learning about this. There's a lot of open source software that I use in my everyday aerospace career that is actually free to students. And so if you can pick up one of those in a manual, then you can actually learn outside of your time. And I would highly encourage it. And so, most people I work with are, mechanical engineers or electrical engineers or physicists and things like that. They all did this sort of stuff outside of work because they were aware that was out there. So it's just about opening your eyes, finding those softwares and resources, and just setting a little bit of time aside each week to learn about them.
Yeah, great. Um, we've also got a question from Evie, who's also with April. Is sort of going to America inevitable for kids in Australia that are interested in careers in aerospace?
No, I think that people don't realize that Australia's been involved in aerospace for many of years. We had ground stations here in Australia when we were attempting to land on the moon in the 60s and 70s. And so there's always been pathways into aerospace in Australia. We have a really a good field of astronomy and physics here, especially where we are located on the Earth. And so, no, I don't think it's inevitable to go to the United States or a country that has larger space programs and more opportunities. Every year now, there are more opportunities here in Australia, and I highly encourage for people to seek out those first, because that in turn breeds more opportunities here in Australia. I will say, if you have the opportunity to go to another country to learn aerospace, look at those opportunities, and if they're better for your career or they interest you, I wouldn't turn those away either.
Oh, cool. And I mean, I guess the other thing is, Australia just has this fledgling space industry right now. We've got this growing number of startups. We've got, Gilmore Space and a number of other companies that are sort of providing some really cool opportunities
Exactly.
for kids coming out of uni, and particularly like those grads who are willing to just get their hands dirty and, do it, which is, I mean, what you did in the US to get to where you are. But I think there's a lot to be said about, just finding a company that does what you want to do and just, locking in and pursuing it.
Yeah, exactly. And I try to tell kids that are looking for a career, when you're first applying, don't necessarily look for the exact role that you want to do, but look for a company that does what you want to do, because you'll be able to learn and switch. And as you've seen, I've had three different jobs at Firefly, and the job that I got was not even the one I applied for. So,
It's pretty cool. Um, cool. So from, I think I'm looking at my list here. From Benoa State High School, how did you stand out from other students? And I'm assuming that's in your like application to UT where you only applied to one university and got in.
yeah, that's an interesting one. So I think the way to stand out is to apply what you do to what you want to do. So I had a mining internship, just because that was applicable here in Australia. I also worked on the farm most of my life. So instead of seeking out what I think they wanted in applicants, which was to do have a lot of programming skills and things like that, what my main focus was to apply what I had done and how that would make me a good prospective student, how my work ethic would, in turn, get me good grades, and also, be a good student for professors and things and get into research. And so I wouldn't necessarily seek out what everyone else is trying to do to get into that industry or what you see online. But take initiative of what you do today. You can go maybe work for a civil company that builds bridges, but getting those foundational skills and applying those to the degree that you want to do is what they really look for. So they know that kids coming out of high school are not going to have all the experiences in the world and be able to answer every single question, but it's showing that you're willing to do so, and that you're enthusiastic.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. I've got another question. This is from Natalie, who's in year five. I'm not sure what school she's joining us from today, but how old were you when you decided you wanted to pursue a career in space? And a related question from, oh no, the thing is moving so fast. I've lost it. I can't remember who it's from, but someone else also asked, like, what did you want to do when you're in grade seven? So I think they're like kind of related. So let's try
Yeah,
and
I think
get
that
them
was,
to, yeah.
I see Ben in Sydney asked that question.
Yes.
So when I wanted to do a career in space, I was pretty young. I knew I wanted to work in physics or astrophysics or some sort of space, in primary school, probably, from grade three onwards. Down in WA, and in the country, you can see the Milky Way. Uh, pretty well. In the Northern Hemisphere, you can't do it. So I always wanted a career in space because it was just out there and you'd see shooting stars or read about the International Space Station. In high schools, when I researched doing physics, and I saw how competitive it was and how, you know, there were less opportunities out there for it. And I kind of decided that I didn't want to do a career in space because I didn't have the opportunity to. It wasn't until I went to the United Space School that I realized that a career in space is not just physics, it's any STEM, or like I said, we have fashion designers or mechanics that work in space. So anyone can actually work in space. And it wasn't until I went on that camp and saw people doing it. I got to meet the plumber of the International Space Station that astronauts would call him when they had an issue with their toilet. So anything like that can get you into space, and that's when I realized I wanted to get into space. And then what did I want to do when I was in grade seven? I think that was around about the time that I decided that, I was off on a high school, but I might just do mechanical engineering and come back home. And so it was a bit of back and forth for years while I was in primary school and high school, but I'm glad I picked to do aerospace in the end.
Yeah, cool. From CBAS at Fremantle College, what Australian universities would you recommend for an as aerospace or astrophysics pathway?
Yeah, I'm not as knowledgeable on which ones have aerospace degrees. I know there's two in Sydney, I believe, that have degrees catered towards aerospace. But then there's, even here in Perth, we have Curtin and UWA that don't have specific aerospace programs, but they do have a CubeSat program or a rocketry program that's outside of their degree. So, if you're able to apply to a university that does do specific aerospace projects, whether that be part of the degree or an extracurricular, I would highly recommend those because that's the easiest way to get hands-on experience. But in my opinion, at the end of the day, you're able to get into aerospace if you do any type of degree at any university. It's just how you apply that degree, and how much you want to work outside of that to get into the aerospace industry.
Yeah, I would agree. You sort of spoke about how you're part of the Longhorn rocketry team. If you look at Australian universities, there are a bunch of universities that have very high performing, very excellent rocketry teams, despite not having aerospace engineering programs. So yeah, it's useful for students to look at, those teams and other things associated with the universities,
Yeah,
for where they might be able to learn alongside, doing a mechanical or mechatronics or something degree that could lead them to space.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
cool. Um, awesome. Okay. From Leah and Georgia, what does your job actually entail? Like, what do you actually do? Do you build prototypes or do you do computers? Do you do technology? Like, what do you actually do?
It's a good question. So my job now as a spacecraft systems engineer is all of the above. So we get a contract. Sometimes there can be a contract or a proposal out there that we want to bid for. So what I could be doing is writing like a report about how we you would use existing technology that we have and how we would apply it to that contract. My day to day could be going, we have a mass budget. We can only be at 500 kilograms. But when we put all those components together, how much do we weigh? Okay, where do I need to move components? Where do I need to remove or change components? My day to day may look like doing our orbital analysis. So I need to pick ground stations that we want for a mission. So what I need to do is go and use the software and simulate a full year's worth of orbits to see which ground stations would be best for our ground tracks. And so a lot of my work consists around the design of the spacecraft. And then what we do is we do make prototypes. I also assist in, when the time comes, what we call environmental testing. So that's when we've built components of the spacecraft. We integrate them together, put them together, and then we go to a facility and we put them under stressful conditions to make sure that they would survive launch or 2 years in space. So there's a lot of testing there as well. So I could physically have a laptop in the clean room with an Ethernet cable plugged into the flight computer that we have on the spacecraft, sending it commands, making sure that we get the correct responses, recording those down, working with the test engineers. So I'm pretty lucky that I get to work in every aspect of aerospace in my day-to-day life. Obviously, When I was flight director or testing engines, they were very different. When I was flight director, I was making a lot of procedures. So I'd get into work. We would identify that, hey, we need to do a burn and this takes 1 hour. What are the commands that we need to send prior to that? And what is the telemetry we need to get down to verify that it was done successfully? So for 4 hours in the morning, I would sit there and look at all of our functional tests and all the guides that were given to us or previous tests, and I would put them into chronological order for us to test on the simulator and then on the actual vehicle. And then, when I tested rocket engines, it was get in very early in the morning, talk to the engineers that were responsible for building the engine, and they said we wanted to do a hot fire for 45 seconds and we needed to swap out this one part. So I would work with the technicians to install the engine onto the test stand. And then I was responsible for all the checkouts. So making sure that there were no leaks. We would be sending commands. We would be putting what's called pneumatic gases that don't react through the engine to purge it from anything that does react or would be detrimental. And then we would prime the engine, and I would be the one to send the command to start the hot fire. So my day to day in the last 2 years has looked very different. Sometimes it can be sitting and doing emails for 3 hours in the morning, and sometimes I can be in the clean room for 3 hours in the morning.
Yeah, cool. And just, an addition from me for that, how much of that did you actually learn in your degree versus what you've learned just being in the workplace?
I would say I've learned about 90% being in the workplace. So the degree has really helped me have, fundamentals or understand the history and why we do things. And, but at the end of the day, there's sometimes I forget things from my degree and I have to go back and relearn it. And like I said, the majority of people I work with are not aerospace engineers. And so everyone that does mechanical or electrical or civil or computational engineering, they learn it on the job. And so you don't have to do aerospace engineering. If you do aerospace engineering, you just get to learn some things a little earlier. But at the end of the day, I've forgotten a lot of that. And then I have to relearn because what we're doing at Firefly Aerospace is usually different to what you learn in university slightly.
And I imagine your company's doing things for the first time.
Yes.
So, like, there's nothing to learn from if you're, I guess, for want of a better term, making it up as you go.
Yeah, correct. So when we're trying to land on the moon, we understand that the moon has 1/6 of Earth's gravity, and we understand the effects and things like that. But we still have to design a solution that does it successfully. We can look at older polar data, but it's much easier to land on the moon when you have a pilot, than when you don't have a pilot. So essentially, we're having to do things for the first time, and so it doesn't really help too much when you're 5 years out of an aerospace degree. You learn a lot on the job.
Yeah, awesome. A question from year five at Our Lady of Fatima at Kingsgrove. What sort of cameras do you use in space? And like, how do you protect them from like the radiation of space?
Yeah, so there's terms we call it flight or space rated hardware versus not. Some hardware is more susceptible to radiation in space, and some hardware is not. So the cameras that we used on the Blue Ghost 1 spacecraft were actually the same ones that they used on Orion. So there was a company that built some of those cameras, and then we purchased 10 of them and we put them on board. And as you can see in the video, we did not put any visors on them, so there's a lot of sun glare. But we did actually have some issues with the cameras. So, even though the camera was space rated, the SD cards that we put in them were not so space rated. And when you have volatile or non-volatile memory, space radiation can affect those. So, fun fact, we only had about two cameras working about 24 hours before we landed, and we had to fix them so we could get the footage of us landing. So, yeah, it's an interesting. Sometimes there are pieces of hardware that you do not have to space rate. A lot of our thermal sensors, they look like little patch sensors. We don't really buy ones that are super space rated on the way to the moon. But the ones that we need on our spacecraft that orbit the Earth for 2 years, we do need them to be space rated. So it's a give and take of cost and also risk.
Yeah, cool. And the students joining us from Our Lady of Fatima also want to know if you've also ever worked with Mark Rober.
Mark Rober, I don't think so.
I think he's a YouTuber that used to work
No,
for NASA.
my company may have, but
Hmm.
I haven't personally. No.
Yeah, yeah, cool. And Phoenix, who is doing our tech from physics today, they had a question about your big, large vacuum chamber and how long it takes you to get down to an extreme vacuum when you're using it.
Yeah, so the one that we used at JPL for our Blue Ghost mission lander would take over a day to get it down to vacuum rating that we needed. The ones that you saw in the photo were a little bit larger for our GOES spacecraft, could take up to 4 days. And so it was pretty much a full-time job. And if they ever found a leak or something wasn't working right, then you'd have to set it back down, try and fix it, and then go again. So they do take a long time because they are quite large and it takes a lot of energy and force, and you have to be very careful because they can be dangerous machines.
Yeah, cool. And the catalyst that you use that goes green and gives Firefly its logo, is that copper based or is
Uh,
it
no, I know that it is
public knowledge?
called TEATEB, so it stands for something. All I know is it is pretty toxic and it burns at the presence of oxygen. I didn't learn too much about it. I just learned how to get rid of it, and how much of it we needed to start an engine hot fire.
Very good. I mean, the chemistry behind those things must be incredible. Um, and yeah, I guess that's another whole area of
It
space
is.
is, the chemistry behind rocket propellants and fuels and how to use them, right?
Yeah, and so the rocket propellant that we use in space as well to the ones on the ground are very different. So, like I said, the ones on the ground need a catalyst to start the combustion, but we can actually use propellants in space that don't need a catalyst. So, for our Blue Ghost spacecraft, we use what's called a hypergolic propellant. It's a monopropellant used with liquid oxygen. And it combusts on the presence of oxygen, so you don't actually need that TTIP, but it's extremely toxic. So even if there's a drop of it that gets out into the air, it can kill whoever's around, and doing the filling up. So even when we test those engines that need to use that propellant, if the wind is going the wrong way, they don't even risk testing it. And so we can be using very dangerous chemicals, and I think when I tested rocket engines, I was actually more stressed than when I was flight director of a moon lander, just because we had technicians and operators around that engine, and you have to be very careful what you do because you could seriously hurt somebody.
Yeah. And actually, you spoke about that really well when you were on the radio with Dr. Carl last week, which, is a great segue for me to tell everyone that we've put the link to that podcast. So Jackson did Science with Triple J, Science with Dr. Carl and Triple J last Thursday. There's a podcast which is on the ABC website, which is really cool to listen to if you want to learn more about the wider space stuff that Jackson works with, and whether he likes sci-fi movies, and things like that too. Jackson, is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up today?
No, I don't think so. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the questions from all the students, and hopefully I've convinced some more kids to get into aerospace.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jackson. Everyone, we will be uploading this to our YouTube channel, so we'll share you that link once it's live if anyone is interested in catching up later. But thank you all for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you.